Hello there, I'm David Common in Ottawa. This is Power and Politics. We are just hours away from President Donald Trump's trade deadline. Canada has yet to secure a deal. Talks ongoing in Washington. We're going to get an update on where those stand just ahead. Trump has said no extensions, but Mexico's getting one for 90 days. Coming up, some insight from Mexico's former chief trade negotiator. And Conservatives are accusing the Liberal government of rewarding terror after the Prime Minister announced Canada will recognize Palestinian statehood this fall. We will hear from both the government and the opposition on this move. Power and Politics starts right now. We are getting close to deadline time in Canada-U.S. trade talks, and there could be a new sticking point. President Donald Trump posting early this morning, wow, Canada has just announced that it is backing statehood for Palestine. That will make us very hard to make a trade deal with them. Trump continued, oh, Canada. Then this afternoon, this.
You know, I didn't like what they said, but, you know, that's their opinion. I didn't like that. Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called, and we'll see.
He, being the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, top Canadian officials in Washington trying to reach a deal before Trump's deadline of, it would seem, midnight tonight. CBC's Peter Armstrong is in the American capital and joins us now. Hey, Peter.
Hello, David.
Where do things stand?
It's really hard to say, if we're being completely honest. The line that really stood out for me, you highlighted there, we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called and we'll see. We know that Trump so he signed all these deals with, you know, Japan, South Korea, whoever it may be. For those to get into effect at midnight tonight, he still needs to sign them through an executive order. He still needs to make them official. So there is something that will happen between now and midnight tonight that will allow those to go into order. So he'll have to sign them at some point, which makes you think that, you know, if he wasn't going to sign them at his other executive order signing today, will there be something later on today? The fact is, we just don't know. And the sense in this town is, you know, you really do. I sort of said it jokingly the other day that everyone's kind of on tenterhooks every time the president takes to a microphone, but it's becoming very real. And you do have to just sort of watch everything and wonder what is it that he's going to say. In terms of sort of how the administration, at least, is feeling, you got some sense of that from Trump. But his Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was on with Fox Business News talking about Canada and about the prospects of what might happen over the next 7 hours. Let's take a listen to this.
The Canadians put out, oh, we're going to recognize the Palestinian state. I mean, come on, don't be so tone deaf, right? The president is totally into trying to get peace in Gaza, and you're throwing your hat in the ring from Canada? Come on. You know, they still haven't solved dairy. They still have two countries on the whole world retaliated against the United States of America tariffs. China, which we all know, and Canada. So, you know what? I just don't see the president stepping off the gas.
I don't see the president stepping off the gas. I think that's a really good way of putting it. But at the same time, David, and I think this is such a subtle nuance, but a few people have pointed it out to me today, nobody, whether it's Lutnick or the president's social media posts, have said there's not going to be a deal with Canada. And as we know, Trump likes his bluster. He often says things more clearly than, you know, than they turn out to be. And they have all left wiggle room for something here, for a negotiation, for a pause, for an extension, for a something. The question as the clock ticks down is, what will that something be?
Yeah, exactly. And we continue to watch in the coming hours. As you say, could be an extension. Yesterday, he said no extension, but then Mexico got one. Lutnick talking about Canada, Trump talking about Canada. There's some Democrats talking about Canada as well.
This is really interesting, David. I've been down, I sort of keep popping in and out of Washington, coming down from Toronto, when all these sort of trade issues come to a head. And I've been struck by the mood that you know, you come down and people have been really wholeheartedly behind Trump and confused a little bit about why are Canadians so upset by this, the 51st state stuff. They think it's a joke. The tariffs, well, everybody's getting hit by tariffs. This time around, I've spoken with more Americans who seem to get it, who seem to understand that something has broken in the Canada-U.S. relation and that Canadians are upset. So listen, this is Tim Kaine, Democrat Tim Kaine, talking about, well, part of that. Take a listen to this.
We've got businesses now, or consumers in Canada, for example, they will not buy American products. They will not travel to the U.S. because they're so mad about the disrespect that is being visited upon them by Trump. So there's a triple level effect of raising the costs of imports, leading to retaliatory effects, and then a reputational effect that's really socking our people.
So it's an interesting change, and I think that's something that I think a lot of Canadians would sort of nod and say, well, yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. I don't think until this time that I've been here that I have felt that idea that Canadians are not only upset, but doing things that would change their relationship with the United States outside of a handful of tourist centers that have seen it very clearly firsthand, what this means for them and for their local economies. It's interesting to see how people are starting to sort of internalize what that anger from Canada might actually mean.
Yeah, more dominoes to fall, too. Peter Armstrong, senior business correspondent. Appreciate your time in Washington. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. President Trump announced a tariff extension for Mexico this morning, posting to social media, "We have agreed to extend for a 90-day period the same exact deal as we had for the last short period of time." Now, this delay comes one day after Trump said there would be no extensions on his August 1st deadline.
En ese sentido, pues es un muy buen acuerdo mantenernos como estamos y seguir.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is celebrating this as a win for her country. The extension will keep in place the 25% tariff on all goods that are not covered by the existing Continental Free Trade Agreement. For countries without an extension, including Canada, tariffs would be expected to hike tomorrow. Kenneth Smith Ramos is Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA and now a partner at Aegon. He joins us now. Good day, sir.
How are you, David? It's a pleasure to be with you again.
What is it about Mexico's approach that got it the very first extension from the president?
Well, I think since the beginning of the Trump administration, the Mexican administration has tried to ensure that their policy vis-a-vis the trade negotiations is one of negotiating and not confronting. Mexico has decided not to implement trade retaliation, and from the beginning has tried to show to the Trump administration that they are willing to negotiate and collaborate on key foreign policy issues such as immigration and fentanyl. And I think that the result today in terms of getting the 90-day reprieve is a recognition by President Trump that Mexico has been advancing on several fronts. I think it speaks well of the strategy that President Sheinbaum has pursued. And of course, the problem remains that we are still facing these tariffs. The Mexican government is trying to get a complete exclusion of all goods that comply with the USMCA from any of the tariffs that the US is implementing right now, but also future tariffs, because as you know, the US is conducting 7 national security investigations under Section 232 that could affect Mexico in the future.
As you say, Mexico chose just the path of negotiation. Canada chose the path of negotiation and retaliation. Does the extension that Mexico now has and Canada does not, does that show that Canada's approach was not the right one?
Well, you know, it's hard to tell because up until this morning, really, despite the very different approaches that Mexico and Canada had taken, as you explained, vis-a-vis the United States, we were both in the same boat. In other words, I think the reason why we have a slightly preferential treatment, and I mean Mexico and Canada up to today, vis-a-vis other countries in the world, is precisely because of the USMCA. Mm-hmm. That provides a certain level of protection. The US actually allowed, as was explained in the segment at the beginning of this section, that the US is allowing products that comply with the USMCA not to pay the 25% tariff. They didn't do this for other trade agreements that the U.S. has, neither with South Korea, Colombia, Chile, Peru. So there's a certain recognition that the USMCA is very important and that it should not be dismantled. Now, we don't know going forward if the Canadian strategy from the government perspective will be the same? Or what will Mexico do if in the next 90 days we still don't have any progress on the tariffs? Because it's good to get this reprieve, but it also shows that the Mexican and US governments have not been able to come to a long-term agreement on how to eliminate these tariffs. And as you know, whatever happens in these tariff negotiations, both for Mexico and Canada, will definitely impact the review of the USMCA that's scheduled to begin early in 2026.
Yeah, and I actually want to talk about the timing of that, because the reprieve, the 90-day reprieve that Mexico now has, actually pushes to the point at which Congress must be notified that the USMCA is going to be renegotiated. Do you just try to keep pushing the puck down until you get into those formal negotiations, when you can produce something that across the continent, between the three countries, that is more likely to last?
Well, I think it's in the interest of all three countries to get out of this tariff hurricane that we find ourselves in right now. The sooner we're able to come to some sort of longer-term agreement not to hit each other with tariffs, we can clear the deck of these irritants and then have a better chance to have a positive review of the agreement in 2026. And as you well point out, by October, USTR has to begin its consultations in general with the private sector and civil society in the US. And by January, it has to present this report to Congress as to its intentions and goals of with the USMCA review. So I think we shouldn't think about kicking the can constantly. It's good to have this reprieve, but hopefully these 90 days will make or break, the situation in terms of the tariff negotiations. Hopefully we can clear the deck, as I said, and have no tariffs as we enter into the review of 2026. That's also unlikely, because in the negotiations that the US has had with the EU, with the UK, with Japan and Vietnam, it has forced its trading partners to reduce its tariffs to zero or close to zero, but it's maintaining a baseline tariff in the case of Japan and the EU of 15%. So that could be problematic if that's the position the US takes during the USMCA review.
So let me ask you, because you've actually been inside the room with the Americans doing negotiations during the previous Trump administration, for the Canadians, who are either the Prime Minister trying to reach the White House, according to the President right now, or Dominic LeBlanc, who is their Canadian cabinet minister, set to try to negotiate that deal along with the Canadian ambassador. What is your advice in these final hours before the deadline to try to get a deal done?
Well, I think the advice would be similar to the advice I've been giving to the Mexican government. I think both Mexico and Canada have very strong arguments to present to the US, saying that they are strategic partners of the United States, that the US economy needs the Canadian economy and the Mexican economy to really be able to compete with China for the remaining of the 21st century. It's not just a question of wanting to have a strong trading relationship with Canada and Mexico going forward. It already exists. We're the number one, number two trading partners. So talking about the strategic alliances that Canada has had with the US, not just on trade and economic front, but also politically, militarily throughout the decades, and showing that Canada wants to build, along with the US and the US and Mexico, the most competitive region in the world. I think those should be persuasive arguments going forward in the discussions with the United States.
Kenneth Smith Ramos, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We'll see what happens.
It's a pleasure, as always. Thank you.
That is Kenneth Smith Ramos, Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA. Well, that trade deadline, now just hours away at this point, it really is still not clear whether a deal with the Americans is possible before then, or whether the extension that Mexico arranged might also be extended to Canada. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford is calling for the country to stay focused.
We can build anything here. We're an economic powerhouse. Folks, we don't have to take a back seat to anyone in the world, and we sure the heck don't have to take a back seat to President Trump. He needs to remember, yes, they're our number one customer, but we're their number one customer. So I wouldn't roll over, and I've told the Prime Minister, do not roll over, hit that guy back as hard as we possibly can, and that's what we need to do.
Turn now to Ontario's representative in Washington, David Patterson. He's with us now. David, good to see you.
Hi, David.
Do we know anything about where things stand?
Well, I suppose there's a good 6 hours left in the day here in the embassy in Washington, and there's always the ability to pick up a phone and to talk with folks. But I think, just as the Premier was saying, and as Mr. Ramos is saying, I think that this may feel like sort of the end of a crazy game of musical chairs, but we should not be overreacting. And we really support the Prime Minister's approach that we need to get the right deal, not just any deal. We are their most important customer, and we are their most important trading partner. And so we need to do this correctly. The team here in the embassy in Washington has been working extremely hard over a period of time. And when the time is right for that agreement to come together, it will. And so we will get up, the sun will shine in the morning, and we will carry on.
I mean, you're in the same building as them. Do you know if they have actually met face-to-face with the Americans today?
I'm not sure if they have today. I know they have several times in the last week or so. Dominic LeBlanc's been here this week. I've talked with the ambassador myself a couple of times. So there's lots of good discussion with USTR, with Commerce, Jameson Greer, and Commerce Secretary Lutnick. The issues are not simple. And I think, frankly, the way that the Prime Minister has set out, I think very much in plain sight, the things that are most important for the president on this in terms of security issues, defense, the border, the incredible job that has been done with respect to fentanyl, and then all the many, many things that we are so integrated with our supply chains that are really in the interest of the U.S. That's the logic that we need to follow through to the end. So a little bit of drama today, but as I say, it's more important to continue on. And I'll tell you, I was in Congress this week as well, and there's a lot of people cheering for Canada in terms of getting back to a little bit more predictability, a lot more certainty, and being able to kind of grow our economy together. So we'll get there. As your previous guest was mentioning, going back to March when Premier Ford was down here in Washington, we really established the notion of USMCA compliant amount of trade. And as it's now been well discussed this week, we have over 90% of our trade that falls into that category. So, but the tariff template that's out there for others, it doesn't fit for people in Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie or in the lumber industry. So we have to keep going. And there's no point in accepting this template that's not going to work for Canada.
You mentioned the Premier, and Premier Ford has been from the beginning saying we have to hit back, we have to retaliate. But I look at what the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, said just a short time ago. He said there are only 2 countries in the world that retaliated to the American action, that China was one of them and that Canada was one of them. I'll be frank with you, I don't know if that's true. I haven't had the time to check it. But does it suggest that our decision to respond with our own tariffs to American goods, that has complicated matters with the Americans when it comes to negotiations?
Well, I can tell you that in my conversations here, there's a high degree of respect for people that stand up for themselves, and including the Premier and the Prime Minister. I think that there is, a recognition that we absolutely need each other. And as the Premier's fond of saying, let me translate into Canadian, when we hear that they don't need our natural resources or our cars or whatever, they really do. If you say it in Canadian, they need it. And so we'll work towards the right solution in those areas. As mentioned earlier today, even Treasury Secretary Bissent commenting that without Canadian aluminum, the auto industry down here suffers. Ford makes so many of its pickup trucks with Canadian aluminum. The military needs our nickel from Ontario. Potash is needed for the next round of crops down here. So, follow the economics on this and you get to the logical end, which is we've got to get back to doing business together, and we will.
I do want to ask you about the what if, the no deal scenario. The threatened number is 35%. Now, that's not on every product that Canada, you represent Ontario, it's only those that aren't covered by our free trade deal. If it's 35%, what does it mean to Ontario businesses?
Well, what it means is that those companies and products that are not able to qualify for duty-free passage, and that's some 90% is noted of our trade right now is still duty-free. But those companies that, for example, would not meet USMCA because perhaps they import products, make something else and send it to the United States and didn't have enough North American content in that, would see their tariffs move up from 25% up to 35%, and that could make the difference for some of those companies. And so,
when you say make the difference, like that,
at all.
Are you saying that could make the difference between staying in business and not? What the difference between what?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, similarly, as Canada has retaliated with some of our tariffs on U.S. goods coming in, that can hurt companies here. So we need to get to zero on both sides. And we've been living with that degree of pain for a good period of time. The biggest area of pain right now is on our auto sector, our steel sector, and aluminum sector. Around the world, people have been signing up for 15% tariffs on those things. And that's really just not right or acceptable, especially when we have an underlying USMCA agreement that's supposed to be 0% trade. So, I follow the direction of the Premier here, which is let's stand up for our business, let's be confident, and let's realize that Canada and Mexico are different than the rest of the world. They're the country. I'm really pleased that Mexico's got this 90-day reprieve. We'll see what happens at the end of the day today. China is also not done as well. So there's a number of very big trading partners that have not landed where the president would like to see them. And that's fine. Let's stand up for with a little bit of confidence.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. David Patterson, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
That's David Patterson, who's Ontario's representative in Washington. We now know Canada intends to recognize Palestine as a state this fall. Conservatives say that amounts to Canada turning its back on Israel. We will hear from the Liberal government and the official opposition on this matter. That is next. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is condemning the Liberals' major foreign policy shift. That is the decision of the Carney Liberals to recognize a Palestinian state very shortly without peace talks or a rejection of terror. They argue that it rewards violence, not peace. Palestinians deserve to live free of Hamas and other terrorist groups where the people can build their lives and raise their families living peacefully next to the Jewish state. That is the two-state solution Conservatives support. Prime Minister Mark Carney made the announcement last night, saying he thinks the prospect of a two-state solution has weakened.
Regrettably, this approach is no longer tenable. Prospects for a two-state solution have been steadily and gravely eroded, including by the pervasive threat of Hamas terrorism to Israel and its people.
For more on Canada's decision, I'm joined by Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rob Olphant. Mr. Olphant, good day to you.
Good day to you.
The Prime Minister laid out three conditions yesterday under which Canada would recognize Palestinian statehood. So Canada's made the decision to make this conditional, but it's not on actually fulfilling those caveats. It's on the commitment to do so. Why not wait until they've at least done one of them?
I think this is the art of diplomacy. What this is Canada recognizing that we have a long based pattern where we have talked about a two-state solution. We've reached a position where it is now an untenable situation, obviously caused by Hamas and continued by the humanitarian crisis given the war waged by Israel. And right now we're looking for a way to get out of that. And so we add our voice to a diplomatic chorus to say we believe that an important step right now is the recognition of the state of Palestine to give hope, to inspire and to incentivize both sides to lay down arms, to have hostages released, and to begin that process towards two viable states living side by side.
But your government chose to make this conditional. One of those conditions, for instance, is that they have democratic reforms and elections. They haven't managed to do that in 19 and a half years. What gives us the confidence that them saying they will means it'll actually happen?
Well, we have been working with the Palestinian Authority on this, and we have said there's no room for Hamas in this. You're right, it's been 19 years since we've had elections. They've had elections, and we don't expect elections to happen right away. Let's face it, there's utter destruction in Gaza. Utter destruction. There's violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so we recognize that you can't impose those right away. However, with the intentions, with building blocks, with $10 million of Canadian money going into helping governance in the Palestinian Authority, we believe that those things can happen. And that will bring about peace for both Israel and Palestinians, and that they can work this out. Do I think there's a magic wand? No. Do I think that Canada has the power to create something by itself? No. But we can work with other countries, with allies, like-minded, to make sure that we are moving the ball along. Otherwise, the destruction will continue. There is no military solution in this situation. There's only a diplomatic solution. So Canada's diplomatic voice is being added today. And I'm very proud of Mr. Carney, the Prime Minister, for doing this. I think it's the right thing to do.
I do want to ask about one more of those conditions, and it's that the Palestinian state that we would then recognize would be demilitarized. Well, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas basically hate one another. The Palestinian Authority has almost no influence in Gaza, where Hamas does have weapons and influence. It won the last elections handily. What is there to say that demilitarization is possible when Hamas is not the party that we're dealing with?
Well, Hamas needs to be squeezed out. That is the first thing. And we will work with the Palestinian Authority on that and with others on that. There is no place for Hamas in a future Palestinian state. It's a terrorist organization. Palestinians have been bombarded by Hamas and now are being bombarded by Israel. That needs to stop on both sides. What we will continue to work for is a new way of being in that part of the world. The terrorists have to have their weapons taken away. If they don't lay them down, they need to be taken away. Canada will work with partners around the world to ensure that we have a demilitarized situation. This is not new. We have had this problem with other countries in the world before, where we have to find a way to demilitarize something. Is it perfect? Is it easy? No. But these are baby steps towards a diplomatic solution to a humanitarian crisis that Canadians have said enough is enough.
The Conservatives have argued this rewards Hamas for its murderous October 7th attack. The Conservatives not alone in saying that. How do you counter the way in which it might look to some?
There's no reward in this for Hamas, and there's no punishment in this for Israel. What this is finding a way for two people to live side by side. So I don't celebrate this. What I will celebrate is when peace breaks out, and when we have a diplomatic solution, and when we have two states that are able to work side by side, recognizing their future interests are bound together. And we have to have a safety and security for Israelis, safety and security for Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and safety and security and a rebuilt country in Gaza. That is what we need to have happen.
Can I just briefly ask you, just on the timing of this, the recognition by the Prime Minister, that announcement has come 2 days before the trade deadline with the Americans. And the President found out about it and said it's going to be hard to get a trade deal with them. Why not just wait a few days?
Canada is negotiating the trade deal with the United States in good faith. We will work until we get the best deal for Canada and Canadians. And trade should not be used as any sort of a weapon. We don't weaponize trade. We're in good faith negotiations to protect Canadian jobs, the Canadian economy, Canadian identity. We will do that. And we expect both parties in this negotiation to do the same. That is what we're doing, and we'll continue to negotiate till we get the best deal for Canada and Canadians. And this is not about foreign policy. This is about a trade deal, and we'll continue to be there in good faith. That's what Canadians expect.
Rob Olphant, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Let's turn now to the official opposition and Michael Chong, who's the Conservative critic for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Chong, good to have you on the program. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You've said that recognizing Palestinian statehood rewards Hamas for its murderous October 7th attack. How much time would have to pass from that attack for statehood to be palatable to you?
Well, first, let me say that every civilian life, whether it's Palestinian or Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, is precious. And that means humanitarian aid needs to flow into Gaza. But now is not the time to recognize a Palestinian state, because recognizing a Palestinian state is not the way to achieve the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And secondly, and more importantly, recognizing a Palestinian state in the aftermath of the October 7th terrorist attack sends the wrong message that violence and terror are an effective way for a group to obtain its political objectives. So the time to recognize a two-state solution, to recognize a Palestinian state, is as part of a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. In other words, Israelis and Palestinians come together, they negotiate a settlement that results in peace in the region, and that settlement has the popular support of both Israelis and Palestinians. And neither one of those conditions are in place. And I'll just finish by saying this, David, that it is sloppy logic to think that just because Canada and a couple of other countries have declared and recognized two states, that will achieve a solution to this longstanding conflict. That logic is sloppy and incoherent.
I would just point out it's not a couple of other countries. You're right that Britain and France have done so in the last week, but there are 147 nations that did so before us.
Agreed, but I would say that the vast majority of Western democracies have not recognized a Palestinian state. And when I refer to a couple of other countries, I'm referring to France, the United Kingdom, considering the recognition of this state. There are about 190 member states of the United Nations. The vast majority of them are not Western liberal democracies. They are in other categories of states. Many of them are authoritarian states and non-democracies. There are only several dozen Western democracies. And of those Western democracies, the vast majority have yet to recognize a Palestinian state because they understand that we cannot give in to force and violence as a way to achieve political objectives. Authoritarian states are happy to do that, but Western democracies have long stood on the principle of negotiated settlement in the region. And the Carney government, alongside the UK, would be dangerously going down the path of caving in to force and violence as a way to achieve political objectives.
You've spoken about that you see statehood recognition should only happen in an instance of negotiation between the two parties. Now, part of the challenge, of course, is Hamas has not even recognized Israel's right to exist, and so doesn't have an interest in negotiating a solution with it. But at the same time, there are members of the Israeli government right now who want to push Palestinians out of their own land. There are some who have called for the complete annexation of the West Bank, to take away the land that Palestinians live on. There are settlers that are doing that. The Netanyahu government talks about a two-state solution, but takes very little action, if any, to actually see that happen. Why should Canada wait for Israel? Why should Canada wait for Hamas before recognizing nationhood of the Palestinian people?
Well, look, Israel is a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. And to be clear, Israel is not a perfect democracy. No democracy is, Canada included. And so we don't agree with some of the actions that the state of Israel has taken in the West Bank and other places. But that said, that is an entirely different issue than the issue of the recognition of a Palestinian state by the government of Canada. We have to work alongside both Palestinians and Israelis to nudge them toward sitting down at the same table and to negotiate a settlement, like was done several decades ago in Norway. We need to do the same thing now. Recognizing a Palestinian state now sends a very dangerous message. It says to groups like Hamas, you don't actually need to sit down and negotiate anything. In the future, you can use force and violence to achieve and obtain your political objectives.
What would be?
And I think it's a danger.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chong, but what would be a nudge? Because the Prime Minister has described this as a nudge to get at least the Israelis towards the table and talking about a two-state solution. What would be a nudge were this a conservative government, for instance?
Well, we should be using all the tools available. First of all, we don't have a lot of resources and assets in the region. And so as a result, we don't have a lot of assets to bring to bear to put pressure on both parties to sit down at the table. But at the end of the day, just because the post-October 7th attacks makes a negotiated two-state solution look even further away than ever, doesn't mean we shouldn't be working toward that end. We need to keep focused on what will achieve long-standing peace and security in the region. And a unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state by Canada and a handful of other countries is not going to get us at that end result. Why would Hamas or any other group in the future ever decide to negotiate with the Israelis to achieve a peaceful settlement? Because clearly that's not the way. If the Carney government goes ahead, if the UK government goes ahead, it's clearly not the way to get their political objective. Clearly force and violence is the way to achieve that if Western democracies start going down the path of recognizing a Palestinian state.
Michael Chong, certainly appreciate your time and thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's Michael Chong, who is the conservative critic for foreign affairs. We're going to turn back to the trade story, where President Donald Trump continues to say that Canada is treating the U.S. very badly, in his words, just hours to go before his trade deadline.
Well, they have to pay a fair rate. That's all. It's very simple. They have been charging very, very high tariffs to our farmers. They've been very poorly led. They've been very, very poorly led. And all we want is fairness for our country.
So, what does the Canadian government do if there's no deal by midnight tonight? Power Panel here with their thoughts. That's next. President Trump's trade deadline is just hours away. Canada still has not secured a deal. That means Canada could face a 35% blanket tariff from the U.S. starting tomorrow on products not covered by our free trade deal. Prime Minister Mark Carney said yesterday that negotiations not yet over. Asked about Canada today, the U.S. president criticized Carney's decision to recognize a Palestinian state this fall, but he said it won't stand in the way of a deal.
You know, I didn't like what they said, but, you know, that's their opinion. I didn't like that. Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called, and we'll see.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford says it's hard to tell what to expect from Trump tomorrow.
Well, Prime Minister Carney's trying his best, but this guy will say something one day, and he'll wake up, and the cheese slips off the cracker, and then all of a sudden he goes the other way. And you're thinking, how do you deal with a guy like this? Are we hoping that we can get a deal with zero tariffs? Yes. But I always say how we can kick back, and it's not the American people, kick back at President Trump. Let's start onshoring everything.
I now wish I'd brought cheese and crackers for the power panel that joins me now. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister, and here with me in studio, James Moore, former Conservative cabinet minister, and Carleen Varian, who's a former chief of staff to Liberal cabinet ministers. Good day to all of you.
Hello.
How are you?
Hi, David.
Do you know, this has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but to date Andrew and I, and make us both sound old, when I was a very junior reporter and he was a very junior finance minister, we would sit on opposite sides of a microphone.
We were so much younger then. I don't know what's happened to me. You still look fine.
It's up close. It's very different, Andrew. Anyway, to the task at hand. James, you hear Premier Ford there talking about his concerns getting the deal done. Can I just ask briefly about the cheese and cracker analogy? I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, I suppose not uncommon, but look, Premier Ford actually plays a helpful role in terms of clearing the room a little bit and saying some things out loud with authority that would be inappropriate for the Prime Minister or our ambassador or anybody who sits around the cabinet table to say. He also reflects a lot of public sentiment about the state of the President of the United States and the way he approaches his bilateral relations with Canada or his multilateral relations with the rest of the world. So he's kind of a useful aspect of the dynamic in Canada in terms of being a release valve for what a lot of people are thinking.
Hey, Carleen, I do want to ask you about what the best case scenario is here as the clock ticks down. Admittedly, it's not as if this is going to happen automatically. The paperwork has to happen. There has to be an executive order. Somebody has to tell the people at the border what to charge. So it's not going to be an immediate thing. Having said all of that, what is the best case scenario?
Well, first of all, when you say as the clock ticks down, I think the question Canadians are increasingly asking themselves is there a clock? Where is it? What time zone is it in? Is it working properly? Are there batteries in it? The timelines constantly shift. The best case scenario for Canada continues to be, for now, to kick the can down the road as far as they possibly can. And the reason for that, mostly, David, is that the Americans have so far demonstrated a bit of a deference and a respect for CUSMA compliance as far as tariffs go. And right now, roughly about 80% of goods that are crossing the border do meet that compliance level, which means that they are duty-free. Now, that doesn't protect and preserve entirely our steel and aluminum sectors, but so long as that deal continues to be in place until next year, it does give us a bit of protection that other countries don't have. So that's why you hear Mark Carney constantly saying no deal is better than a bad deal for now.
Andrew, I want to ask you about what Mexico got. They didn't get a deal, but they got an extension, 90 days. It pushes them up to when CUSMA renegotiations sort of could, the very early stages of that, when that's set to happen. The fact that they got an extension, that we didn't, that they went just for negotiation, but we also did retaliation. What does it say about the differences in our approach and what they netted?
Well, I think we also have to understand that there's big differences about what's on the table. The situation with Canada is much more complicated because of the integration of the economy, the ability for us to retaliate that Mexico doesn't have. I mean, these are much more complex discussions that are going to be going on. Mexico has a much weaker hand than Canada does, and that's, I think, reflected in terms of how they are managing their negotiations, and frankly, it seems they're managing them well from a Mexican perspective. But to suggest that we would move in lockstep with them, I don't think is in Canada's interest. In a lot of ways, the trade situation that we have in the country, as has been pointed out, is largely still covered and protected under CUSMA. The retaliatory tariffs or the aggressive tariffs that the Americans wanted to put on are on. It's unclear really what else gets gained out of this by moving the Canadian negotiations with the U.S. from the U.S. standpoint forward more aggressively rather than trying to settle with some of the other countries first.
I do want to ask about the Palestinian statehood recognition, but I want to ask about it in the context of the negotiations going on now. And I ask because the president saw the statehood recognition, said by social media posts, essentially that this complicates things. What do you make of the timing? And I want us to go specifically on the timing. Canada's decision 2 days before Trump's deadline to do something that was likely to irk him.
Odd and not helpful. There's a saying in politics that in order to be successful in politics and successful in governing, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing for Canada has been August 1st, has been the Canada-U.S. relationship, has been trade. There's no reason why the Prime Minister had to make this decision now and the Government of Canada had to convene a special meeting. I get that the UN General Assembly is coming up, but so what? Let the UN General Assembly come up, let there be a vote, let Canada either abstain or vote no for our own reasons, and recognize that even though the UK and the EU and France have their positions on this that are counter to what the President of the United States thinks about these things, and they managed to have their own trade deal, as Carleen pointed out, this is a president who is all over the road. And his approach to things, as they say, is a science of single instances, which is a science of no science at all. He's all over the road. There's no reason to think that he would treat Canada the same way that he treats Europe or others. So the idea that we would go out of our way to possibly irk the United States at a time like this is not helpful. Now, the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state is something that's been true for Canada for generations, frankly, since the establishment of the State of Israel. That's been true for conservative governments, liberal governments. It's always been the case. And if you look at the way that the Prime Minister talks about this and about the caveats that he'd like to see in place, and the clip that you showed of Pierre Poilievre and the interview you just did with Michael Chong, the positions are actually not that far apart. But it's clear that the Prime Minister wanted the headline to be that Canada is recognizing a Palestinian state, which is an odd thing to do when the Palestinian state, as it is today, currently with the Hamas government, a terror state, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, an act of genocide. And we're going to recognize the Palestinians with that, quote, government in place right now with the atrocities that they committed is not something that I think is appropriate at this time.
Although the Prime Minister, and Carleen, you can do a better job than I ought to do at trying to defend this government's actions, but the Prime Minister did say that Hamas should play no role in any future government.
Sure. So how about recognize a Palestinian government and state at the time when Hamas is no longer being prosecuted for an act of genocide against Israelis who are at a music festival?
Carleen.
If I had to guess what the Prime Minister and his team were thinking about when they made this choice on timing, I would guess that there were two things at play. One was certainly the growing international chorus and the fact that there was a desire to move somewhat in tandem with like-minded allied countries like the UK, like France. The other thing I suspect they were probably keeping in mind is that this isn't exactly a winner of an issue for the government. In fact, I don't think that there's any political party, mainstream political party in Canada that actively wants to be talking about the horrific conflict in the Middle East as a political winner. The timing of doing this and knowing that there would be a great big news story happening one way or the other 2 days later with this trade deadline effectively ensured that they would get a somewhat limited news cycle out of it, more than if it was just dropped in the dead of summer with nothing else to talk about. So those are some fairly I don't want to say cynical, but there's some very practical considerations.
Although
there,
you could have waited until September when there is a lot more news. To James's point, you could have waited till then, and there'd be more things going on in the news.
You could, but I think some of the international alignment that was happening was probably timely for this particular week.
Well, caucus pressure, let's be clear. The caucus clearly wanted this, and they wanted this done a long time ago. I think they wanted more overt signs and signals of solidarity with the suffering of the Palestinian people, which is fine, but in my view, this is not the way to do it, to recognize a Hamas government, or to be seen to be. I know there's a slight variation in language here.
I hear you. You're talking about what are the optics here of
Correct.
What's happening. All right, Andrew, you probably want to get in on this.
I do not. But,
yeah, minefields everywhere.
Yes.
Look, let me ask you, I'll be specific on the timing of it and just get your thoughts around the decision. You've heard the conversation and some of the potential rationale. What do you make of the timing of it?
I mean, I think Carlene's right. And certainly there is this, movement for a group of the Western democracies to try to move forward on this issue in unison, with or without the United States. As part of that, that seems to be the approach that's being taken. That seems to have been decided some months ago, not on this specific issue, but that we would move in tandem with a number of other Western European democracies. I thought Michael Chong's interview was very interesting today, and certainly the most important thing that I think that he brought forward to it is, again, Canada's very much a bit player in this. We have almost no assets in the Middle East. We have almost no ability to project power or influence in the region. And so this does come back to whether we're supporting kind of that European vision of how to move forward, and in process signal that we are maybe one step further removed from the U.S. than we would normally be, which isn't unusual. We were this way on Iraq. We didn't follow the U.S. in complete unison and lockstep. Or are we taking a slightly more independent approach? And I think that that's what's being signaled here. But it is a difficult, difficult domestic issue, and I think one that certainly the Prime Minister has felt he needs to address.
I want to pick up on what Andrew's saying, and I want to ask you two in particular, because you've been in front of the camera, James Moore, not always on a portfolio that would see this issue. But
some would say I am right now, but yeah.
Some would say, what's going on here, right? Yeah. What is it like being in politics and trying to navigate this issue with the interested, engaged parties who have family members in the region here, trying to navigate it, particularly when you are the party in power?
Yeah, it's a big question. I will take it this way. Look at the field as broadly as you can. Try to see as far down as many corners as you possibly can. Draw in as many smart people who will tell you what you've thought of and what you've not thought of, so you can sort of flip over those stones and anticipate the unanticipatable. And be as measured and responsible as you can. As they say, measure twice, cut once. Like, be very thoughtful and deliberate. To the point, I think that was just raised, that Michael Chong pointed out, right, that Canada is not a large player in this space. But domestically, there's huge political traction on this. And frankly, when the NDP leadership race gets kicking up into full steam, I think it'll be a very big issue that will probably rear its head in Parliament, I think, in probably some really ugly ways. So I think what's happening over there and the tragedy that a lot of people are seeing, whether it's the Gazans or the fear that Israelis fear about sort of constant attacks for years to come. I think those tensions and anxieties that people have for family members over there will find their way into the House of Commons, I think, in pretty dark ways, so that people can exploit them for votes. And I think as a government, you have a responsibility to try to rise above that, to see through it, and to make sure that you're doing what's in the best interest, more broadly, of Canada's foreign policy.
But how do you say a message that isn't going to greatly anger one side or another, or be heard in a very specific way, when things are so tense?
It's nearly impossible, and that is why you so often see leaders of governments and political leaders speak in such platitudes when it comes to these topics. This is, in particular, an issue where the Liberal Party is in a really challenging position, because I would venture to say that among the three major federal parties, it is the party that straddles the broadest coalition of individuals who would count among themselves either strong supporters of Israel or very strong supporters of a free and independent Palestinian state, and everybody in between. It is a caucus that is enormously difficult to manage and keep happy on this issue. And so Prime Minister Carney, not just as a new Prime Minister, but as a new leader of a caucus, somebody who's new to those dynamics, I suspect is finding that to be an interesting challenge. One thing in an issue like this that you always have to keep in mind when you're speaking to a nation is that there's nothing that you can say that's going to please everybody. So you have to do the best to find the balance between your own convictions and what decision it is that you've actually had to take that you have to own.
Not the last we'll be talking about this. That is one thing for sure. Thank you to all three of you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
That is our power panel. James Moore, Carlene Varian, and Andrew Thompson. I'm David Common. Thank you very much for watching Power and Politics. You can check out more right here on CBC News Network. We will continue to track all developments coming out of the White House with these trade talks to see what, if anything, happens. If nothing occurs, it is possible Canada faces a 35% tariff on non-free trade deal compliant goods.